Have you ever done something that made you hate yourself? Something so out of character, so shocking that you couldn't believe it came from you? Maybe you exploded in rage at someone you love. Maybe you sabotaged your own success just when things were going well. Maybe you said something cruel, something that cut deep, and then pretended it never happened. Carl Jung, one of the greatest minds in psychology, had a name for this phenomenon. He called it your shadow self. And he said something that will change how you see yourself forever. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Today we're going on a journey. Not to the top of a mountain or across an ocean, but into the darkest corners of your own mind. Because here's what Jung discovered, the very thing you're running from, the part of yourself you're most ashamed of, that's exactly where your greatest power is hiding. This isn't about becoming a better person. This is about becoming a whole person. And trust me, by the end of this journey, you'll never see yourself the same way again. Let me ask you something. When you were a child, were you ever told to be good? To stop being angry? To don't be selfish? Of course you were. We all were. Society has rules, and those rules serve a purpose. But here's what nobody told you: when you pushed down your anger, your selfishness, your wild desires, they didn't disappear. Carl Jung called this rejected part of yourself the shadow. It's not evil. It's not some demonic force trying to destroy you. The shadow is simply every part of your personality that you've been taught to hide, suppress, or deny. Think about it. You were born with a full spectrum of human emotions and drives. Anger, lust, greed, jealousy, pride, aggression. But society said no, good people don't feel these things. So what did you do? You buried them. You locked them away in the basement of your psyche. But energy cannot be destroyed. It can only be transformed or suppressed. And when you suppress your shadow for years, decades, it doesn't get weaker. It gets stronger. It gets hungrier. And it starts looking for ways to express itself. Jung put it perfectly: how can I be substantial if I do not cast a shadow? I must have a dark side also if I am to be whole. Your shadow isn't your enemy. It's the part of you that's been screaming to be heard while you've been pretending it doesn't exist. Picture this scenario. You're having a normal day. Everything's fine. Then someone says something, does something, and suddenly you explode. The words coming out of your mouth shock even you. You're saying things you swore you'd never say. Doing things that go against everything you believe about yourself. And in that moment, you're not in control anymore. Who is? Your shadow. Maybe it's the nice guy who suddenly becomes a monster when he's rejected. Maybe it's the perfect mother who screams at her children in a moment of exhaustion. Maybe it's the successful businessman who sabotages his own company just before the biggest deal of his life. We've all been there. We've all had moments where we looked in the mirror and thought, who was that person? That wasn't me. But Jung would tell you, oh, but it was you. It was the part of you that you've been starving for attention. Here's the terrifying truth: the more you try to be perfect, the more powerful your shadow becomes. The more you deny your darkness, the more it controls you from the shadows. Because what you resist persists. And what you refuse to acknowledge owns you. So how do you catch something that's been hiding from you your entire life? Jung gave us clues. Your shadow leaves fingerprints everywhere if you know where to look. First clue: emotional overreactions. When someone pushes your buttons and you respond with way more emotion than the situation calls for, that's your shadow talking. The intensity of your reaction reveals the size of the wound you're protecting. Second clue: your dreams. Jung believed dreams were messages from the unconscious. If you're having violent dreams, sexual dreams, dreams where you're the villain, pay attention. Your shadow is trying to tell you something. But here's the biggest clue of all: the people you hate. The people who irritate you for no logical reason. The people who make your skin crawl just by existing. Jung had a revolutionary insight: everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. It's called projection. You see in others what you refuse to see in yourself. That arrogant person you can't stand? Look deeper. Is there arrogance in you that you've never acknowledged? That manipulative coworker who drives you crazy? What manipulation tactics do you use that you've never admitted to yourself? This is uncomfortable territory. Because it means every judgment you make about others is actually a judgment about yourself. Every time you point a finger, 3 fingers are pointing back at you. Now comes the hard part. The part most people avoid their entire lives. You have to stop running from yourself. You have to turn around and face the monster you've been feeding in the basement. No more blaming others. No more, I'm not that kind of person. No more, I would never. Because the truth is, under the right circumstances, you're capable of almost anything. And that's not a weakness, that's being human. Start keeping a shadow journal. Every time you have an emotional reaction that surprises you, write it down. Ask yourself, what part of me did this trigger? What am I protecting? What am I afraid of people seeing? When you get angry, don't just say, I'm angry. Ask, why am I angry? What need isn't being met? What boundary was crossed? What fear was activated? This requires radical honesty. The kind of honesty that makes you squirm. Because you're going to discover things about yourself that you don't like. You're going to see patterns you've been blind to. You're going to realize you're not the person you thought you were. And that's exactly where healing begins. Jung had another term, the persona. It's the mask you wear in public. The version of yourself you present to the world. I'm successful. I'm happy. I'm strong. I never lose control. But here's the problem, the brighter your persona shines, the darker your shadow grows. The more perfect you try to appear, the more imperfect energy you're suppressing. Think about celebrities who seem to have it all, but then have spectacular public breakdowns. Think about religious leaders who preach morality but are caught in scandals. Think about politicians who campaign on family values but destroy their own families. It's not hypocrisy, it's psychology. The bigger the lie you tell about who you are, the more truth your shadow accumulates in the darkness. Jung said, we do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. So what's your mask? What version of yourself are you selling to the world? Are you the nice person who never gets angry? Are you the independent person who never needs help? Are you the rational person who never acts on emotion? Whatever your mask is, your shadow is its opposite. And the energy you use to maintain that mask, that's energy you're stealing from your authentic self. Here's where it gets really interesting. Your shadow doesn't just cause random outbursts. It creates patterns. The same problems keep showing up in your life over and over again. Why do you always end up in relationships with people who betray you? Why do you always sabotage yourself right before success? Why do you always feel like the victim in every situation? Because your unconscious shadow is running the show. It's making decisions for you based on wounds you haven't healed, fears you haven't faced, and parts of yourself you haven't accepted. Maybe your shadow carries the wound of abandonment, so you push people away before they can leave you. Maybe your shadow carries shame about your own power, so you make yourself small in every important moment. Maybe your shadow carries rage about being controlled, so you rebel against everything, even opportunities that could help you. And here's the cruel irony, the very behavior your shadow uses to protect you is the behavior that creates exactly what you're afraid of. You fear abandonment, so you push people away so they abandon you. You fear failure, so you don't try, so you fail. You fear being hurt, so you hurt others first, so they hurt you back. But when you make the unconscious conscious, when you bring your shadow into the light, these patterns can finally be broken. This might sound strange, but I want you to try something. I want you to have a conversation with your shadow. Not metaphorically. Literally. Find a quiet place. Get a pen and paper. Write a letter to the part of yourself you've been trying to hide. Ask it questions. What do you want me to know? What are you trying to protect me from? What gifts are you holding that I've been too afraid to claim? Here's what might shock you. Your shadow isn't just carrying your pain and your negative emotions. It's also carrying your unclaimed power, your abandoned dreams, your suppressed creativity. Maybe you always wanted to be an artist, but you were told it wasn't practical, so you buried that desire in your shadow. Maybe you have a natural gift for leadership, but you were taught that ambition is selfish, so you've been hiding your power. Maybe you're naturally passionate and intense, but you were told to calm down, so you've been living a muted version of your life. Your shadow knows what you really want. Your shadow remembers who you were before the world told you who to be. Your shadow is the keeper of your authentic self. When you start listening to your shadow instead of fighting it, something miraculous happens. That energy that was working against you starts working for you. That anger becomes determination. That selfishness becomes healthy boundaries. That pride becomes confidence. Give your shadow permission to speak. You might be surprised by what it has to say. This is where the real magic happens. When you stop seeing your shadow as the enemy and start seeing it as unutilized energy, everything changes. Anger, when integrated, becomes the fuel for justice and change. Greed, when integrated, becomes ambition and drive. Lust, when integrated, becomes passion and creativity. Pride, when integrated, becomes healthy self-worth and confidence. Your shadow isn't something to get rid of. It's something to harness. It's like having a powerful horse that's been locked in a stable for years. When you finally let it out, it might be wild at first, but once you learn to ride it, it can carry you anywhere you want to go. Instead of suppressing your anger, ask, what is this anger trying to protect? What action does it want me to take? Instead of judging your jealousy, ask, what does this jealousy show me about what I really want? How can I create that in my own life? Every emotion you've labeled as negative is actually energy you've been wasting. When you reclaim that energy and direct it consciously, you become more powerful than you ever imagined. This doesn't happen overnight. Integration is a process, not an event. But every time you choose to work with your shadow instead of against it, you become more whole, more authentic, more genuinely powerful. Here's the beautiful paradox. The moment you stop trying to be perfect, you become more perfect than you ever were when you were trying. Because perfection isn't about having no flaws, it's about being whole. Let me tell you what happens when you finally stop running from yourself. When you stop pretending to be someone you're not. When you embrace all of who you are, light and shadow together. First, you feel this incredible sense of relief. Like you've been holding your breath your entire life and you can finally exhale. Because you're not performing anymore. You're not managing your image. You're not terrified that someone will discover your real self. Why? Because you've already discovered it yourself. You've looked at your worst qualities, your darkest impulses, your most shameful secrets, and you've made peace with them. Nobody can threaten you with who you are anymore because you already know who you are. This is what Jung meant when he talked about individuation. It's not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming individual. It's about becoming who you actually are, not who society told you to be. You don't need the mask anymore. You don't need to be the good person or the successful person or the strong person. You can just be yourself. Complex, contradictory, beautifully human yourself. And here's what's amazing. When you stop trying to be perfect, your relationships actually get better. Because people can finally connect with the real you, not just your persona. Authentic connection is only possible when both people are being authentic. You become unshakable. Not because nothing bothers you, but because you're not at war with yourself anymore. All that energy you were using to suppress your shadow, that energy is now available for creating the life you actually want. There's a word Jung used that I love, wholeness. Not perfection. Wholeness. It means including everything. Light and shadow. Strength and weakness. Beauty and ugliness. Love and hate. A truly strong person isn't someone who never makes mistakes. It's someone who can face their mistakes without being destroyed by them. Someone who can acknowledge their flaws without being consumed by shame. Someone who can integrate their darkness without being controlled by it. Every great story, every hero's journey follows the same pattern. The hero must face their greatest fear, their darkest enemy, and discover that their greatest enemy was actually carrying their greatest gift. Your shadow is your dark enemy, but it's also your greatest teacher. It knows where you're stuck. It knows what you're avoiding. It knows what you need to heal. And most importantly, it knows who you really are beneath all the conditioning and expectations. Jung called this process individuation, becoming who you truly are. Not who your parents wanted you to be. Not who society expects you to be. Not who you think you should be. Who you are. This requires tremendous courage. Because you have to be willing to disappoint people. You have to be willing to be misunderstood. You have to be willing to be different. You have to be willing to be yourself. But the reward is everything. The reward is freedom. The reward is authenticity. The reward is power. The reward is wholeness. The reward is finally coming home to yourself after a lifetime of exile. We're coming to the end of our journey together, but really your journey is just beginning. Because shadow work isn't something you do once and you're done. It's a lifelong practice of self-acceptance and integration. Here's what I want you to understand. Your shadow has been with you your entire life. Through every moment of pain, every moment of fear, every moment of shame, it was there. It absorbed the blows so your conscious mind could keep functioning. It carried the burdens you were too young or too fragile to carry yourself. Your shadow deserves your gratitude, not your hatred. It deserves your compassion, not your rejection. It deserves your love, not your fear. Maybe it's time to apologize to your shadow. To say, I'm sorry I've been fighting you all these years. I'm sorry I tried to pretend you didn't exist. I'm sorry I was ashamed of you. I see you now. I accept you now. I love you now. And maybe it's time to make a promise. I won't abandon you anymore. I won't suppress you anymore. I won't be ashamed of you anymore. We're in this together now. We're going to figure this out together. Carl Jung spent his entire life studying the human psyche, and here's what he discovered. The goal isn't to eliminate the shadow. The goal is to have a conscious relationship with it. To be in dialogue with it. To learn from it. To integrate it. Your shadow just wants to be seen. It just wants to be heard. It just wants to be loved. And when you give it those things, when you finally embrace the fullness of who you are, something magical happens. You stop being at war with yourself. You stop being your own worst enemy. You start being your own best friend, your own greatest ally, your own truest love. Jung said it perfectly, the privilege of a lifetime is being who you are. You've been looking for the light everywhere outside yourself. But Jung reminds you of this profound truth: go into the darkness. Face your shadow. Because there, in the place you've been most afraid to look, that's where you'll find the most authentic, the most wounded, the most powerful, and the most beautiful part of who you are. Your shadow is waiting for you. It's been waiting your whole life. Maybe it's time to finally say hello. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. The journey to wholeness begins with a single moment of courage, the courage to look in the mirror and love everything you see, even the parts you've been taught to hide. Welcome home to yourself.